Hey guys, welcome back to the next segment of the Security Plus preparation course. Today we're going to be talking about data protection. Specifically, we're going to be talking about data and how we classify data so we know what kind of protections to put against it. So, data protection itself is definitely the most critical thing that we have today. It's the number one asset that we have to protect. And it doesn't matter who we are. It could be an individual, it could be a business, it could be a government. These are the things that we have to protect. Now, with that said, we need to figure out, well, how do we do this? Are there any strategies, policies, or technologies we can use to start safeguarding the sensitive information? And if so, what does that look like? Because there's a lot of us that are going to be in charge of different parts of data, and there are some regulations that we may even have to follow. For instance, we have the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation, and this is normally for EU, but we still have to follow it if we have any EU citizens that we have as customers. And then we also have the California Consumer Privacy Act, otherwise known as the CCPA. A little more lax, but still is something we have to make sure. So we could either use encryption, backups, access controls, or a whole bunch of other types of security measures to protect our data, but we need to make sure that we do it in the proper fashion. So what is data classification? Well, data classification is the process of organizing data into categories based on its sensitivity, its value, and risk level. Now, we need to ensure that the data is protected according to its importance, just due to the fact that, well, certain data may have more adverse effects to our organization than others. Our main goal here is to try to identify the data and try to figure out which data needs to have the highest security level and which personnel need it to complete their jobs. So we've got a few different types of data classifications. These are very common ones. We've got public, which public data could be freely available to anyone, doesn't require any special public protection. It really has no risk if it was disclosed, modified, or even destroyed. So a lot of this publicly accessible data you'll see is normally on websites. Websites are the number one place that we'll see public data. And we can see things like marketing materials or even press releases here. Our next data is going to be our internal data type. And the internal data type itself is all about having data that should not go out to the public. While it's not highly sensitive, it should be restricted to employees or specific internal teams. This kind of data could be like business reports or internal memos or even organizational procedures. This stuff is not as sensitive as confidential is sensitive, but definitely more so than public. Our next category is confidential. Our confidential information is sensitive information that should not be accessed without authorization because it could do harm to somebody or the organization itself. We normally have to make sure that there are strict security controls for this type of data. And this kind of data could be like intellectual property, trade secrets, or even customer details for an organization. And then we have sensitive. Sensitive data is highly critical information, and it requires the highest level of protection. Unauthorized access to this could lead to significant harm, legal penalties, it could be financial losses, or even reputational damage. Now, this category could be PII data, personal identifiable information, financial information, health records like PHI data, personal health information, or even classified government information. Now, if we look at the benefits of data classification, we'll find that there's several benefits to data classification. One of the things could be enhanced security. Identifying and classifying the information will help us build stronger security measures around our data and put it where it is needed most. Because, as we know, security is expensive, so how do we protect what is important to the organization without wasting information? Or wasting money, sorry. There could be regulatory compliance. So if you're GDPR or CCPA or HIPAA or PCI or whatever it may be, We need to ensure that there's compliance with our data protection regulations. And so this definitely helps us here. We have improved data management, which allows organizations to better manage, store, access, and have a life cycle for our data, including the value and the risk level of the data. And then, of course, as I said, cost efficiency. By focusing on the resources that we need to do to secure the data that needs the most security, then we can ensure that certain data is handled according to its value and its risk level. So let's talk about data ownership. And I kind of put ownership in quotation marks here because you'll see it written a lot of times in other certifications where it says data owner or data steward. And we have to make sure that we know that ownership really is the owner of the data. So ownership refers to the legal rights and responsibilities of the individual, the organization, or the entity that controls and manages the data. The data owner is the person of the organization with the authority to make decisions about this data. So this owner is the one who's going to figure out, well, how is the data handled? How do we protect it? And how do we maintain the data? The owner also ensures that the data is appropriately classified. So we need to make sure that we are in compliance with our legal and regulatory bodies. So what's the responsibility of the data owner? Well, again, as I said, we have data classification. The data owner itself is responsible for classifying data according to the sensitivity and the value of the data. They're the ones who are going to make sure that there's specific security measures and that the data is protected based on its classification level. And remember, the levels could be public, internal, confidential, sensitive, and these are very common levels. Then they look at access control. They look at who has the right of the data and under what conditions. So they need to make sure that the permissions and the implementation of the security measures are proper. So if a certain authorized user is only able to view the data, are they only able to view it and not modify or delete the data? They're the ones who make sure this is protected. Then we got data protection. They're the ones who are responsible for implementing security measures to protect the data from unauthorized access, breaches, or corruption. This could be like using encryption or backup solutions or other safeguards to make sure that we have our integrity or our confidentiality of our data. Because remember, the CIA triad is our tried and true. We need to have it as our foundational knowledge. We have compliance with regulations. So if there are any regulations that need to be complied with, they're the ones to make sure that we're meeting them. And then finally, they're the ones who also give us our data retention policies. So how long should we store the data? Should it be archived? Should it be deleted? We need to ensure that it is securely disposed of when no longer needed to prevent unauthorized access to reduce, for one, storage costs or the chance of a breach. So we got a few data states that we need to know for the SecurityPlus. One of the data states is data at rest. And data at rest refers to any data that's currently stored on physical or virtual storage devices. These could be hard drives, databases, cloud storage, or even backup solutions. So when the data is not actively being used, transmitted, it is considered to be at rest. This state often includes sensitive information like personal data, financial records, or intellectual property. And so while the data is not moving, it is still vulnerable for unauthorized access, theft, or tampering. So we need to ensure that if data breaches or insider threats do occur, that the data is protected. Our next one is going to be data in transit. Data in transit, or data in motion, refers to data that's actively moving from one location to another, such as over the internet, internal networks, or even via email. This includes any data that's transferred between devices, application systems, and even other users. So common risks here could be like man-in-the-middle attacks, otherwise known as on-path attacks. and make sure that when the data does get transmitted, that it's not intercepted by another party. Another protection measure we can do here would be something like encryption, VPNs, secure communication channels like SFTP, and just make sure that we're using secure methods to do our transfers. Our last one's going to be data in use. Data in use refers to data that's actively being processed by applications, systems, and even users. This includes data that's being accessed by being edited or even analyzed in real time. So most of the time this data will be found in like RAM or CPUs because it's being temporarily stored for processing. So how do we protect things that are in use as well? Well, some of the methods we can use would be data masking to make sure that unauthorized only see a version of the data that doesn't have any of the critical elements in it. We could use access control to make sure that only authorized users or applications can see or modify the data. And then we can also use like something like endpoint protection to secure the data and applications when it's being processed. So that way it prevents it from getting attacked when, such as like privilege escalation or malware. So we already talked about defenses there. We already talked about that defense. We've already talked about that defense. Let's move on to data types. So data types, we have a few different data types, and the first one I want to talk about is personal identifiable information. So a data type itself refers to different categories and classification of information. Whether or not it's being processed or stored or in transit, we need to make sure that these data types themselves have proper protections. And so we have a few that you need to know for the SecurityPlus. And as I said, the PII is the first one we're going to go through. Examples of PII is just anything that can be used to identify an individual. So some examples would be their full name, social security number, passport number, driver's license, email, physical address, could even be their phone number. And we need to make sure that these are protected. The next type is going to be personal protected health information. Protected health information refers to anything that's health related, and it could be for an identity of an individual. PHI itself is definitely regulated. It's regulated by regulations like HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act. And that's in the US only, but it tells us how healthcare providers and organizations must store, process, and share PHI data. PHI data could be medical records, health insurance details, test results, prescription information, doctor's notes, anything that can be pushed back to health-related information. Our next type is going to be intellectual property. Intellectual property refers to proprietary information, and it's normally owned by a company or an individual. So different types of this would be like trade secrets, things like formulas or algorithms, patents, product designs, business plans, source code, pretty much anything that is specific to intellectual property that if it did get out, think about it like the secret recipe for Coca-Cola. If it came out, then they could have less sales because another competitor can come up and start selling Coca-Cola under a new name. Next, we have our sensitive personal information. A little bit like PII, but it goes a little bit further with it. It's SPI is highly sensitive data. It kind of needs some additional security beyond PII because it can have a lot of other information like biometric data, your religious beliefs, racial or ethnic information, sexual orientation, political views, and this data needs to be minimalized because there's a lot of times where This data does not need to be collected, but sometimes is collected for a certain reason within an organization. Just like identification information when you apply for a job. That information is there for tax relief or tax credits, but is not needed in most of the organization. Then we have operational data. Operational data refers to the information generated to the day-to-day operations of a business. You could have like sales records, inventory levels, supply chain data, like where do they get their stuff, employee schedules. And while not always sensitive, operation data can still be targeted by the threat actors to disrupt business activities. They could also use this information for social engineering. Next, we have metadata. Metadata is all about other data, really trying to provide context, like how and when or whom the data was created, accessed, or modified. Metadata is not always sensitive, but it is sometimes data that we need to make sure that we protect. Examples of metadata would be like when a document was created, who created a file, file access logs, and maybe even geolocation data from when an image was taken. So we can anonymize this data, protect the access logs, do our due diligence to make sure that this data is protected. The next term that I want to talk about is data sovereignty. Data sovereignty is really the laws and regulations of where it's collected, stored, or processed. So really the concept here is all talking about where does the data reside. Where this data resides is where the law is enforced. So as we're now a globalized economy, we need to make sure that if we're an organization, that we need to store our data in a proper location so we can follow the laws and regulations of that locations. For instance, if you go to the EU, you have the GDPR for privacy reasons. So let's talk about the elements of data sovereignty. So the first one is about judicial. It's about the laws of where it's stored, right? Just like we were talking about. Now, how does this affect when the data is accessed, shared, or even protected? Because there are some countries that encryption is illegal, or the government needs to have the encryption keys in case they want to read the data. So you have to be very cautious about this. Data residency refers to where it's physically stored, again, within a certain location. And when you're doing things with like cloud providers, you have to be very careful because there are a lot of cloud providers that are multinational, they're global. And so we need to make sure that does our data transit through other countries? If they do, we may be prone to those laws as well. Then we talk about privacy and data protection laws. So these are all regulations. How do we follow regulations between these countries? And then we've got the cross-border data transfers. So as I said, with the cloud environment, if we transferred our data through in other countries, are there any additional regulations that we need to meet? So why is this important? Well, we need to be in compliance with local laws. We can get in trouble, have fines, or even be shut down. GDPRs, for instance, our fines are up to 4% of annual revenue, or $20 million, and it's actually whatever's greater. So even if 4% of your revenue is not even $20 million, you could still get hit with a $20 million fine if you do not comply. Data security itself, some countries have strict data protection, like I said, with encryption, so you have to make sure you follow these. We need to make sure that our countries themselves have different data access rules. As I said, sometimes the governments have access to the data by law to the data that's within your company. And then finally, consumers themselves want to make sure that their data is stored and handled properly. So we do make sure that we follow everything and be transparent about us following the rules and regulations of our data. There are times where we may want to stay out of a country because we don't agree with the law, and we want to ensure that our consumers understand this as well. Well, some of the challenges that we have here, as we deal with data sovereignty, is definitely complexity. A lot of things can be very complex when you're trying to follow data sovereignty. It's crazy amount of rules and regulations. When we're dealing with cloud storage, it makes it even harder, especially if we need government access to the data. And data localization requirements means like, well, what rules are there, and can we complicate something that should be very simple by just going through the wrong country? So let's talk a little bit more about securing data. Securing data, again, as I said, is one of the most critical responsibilities in cybersecurity. As the data is more and more valuable, protecting it from unauthorized access, theft, corruption, or loss is definitely essential for maintaining privacy, right? So what are we trying to do here? Well, we've got confidentiality, we've got integrity, and we've got availability. While confidentiality makes sure that only authorized individuals are seeing this data, but how do we enforce it? So different methodologies that we can use to enforce it. For one is like encryption. We can encrypt the data at rest or in transit, and if it's intercepted, it just can't be read without the appropriate decryption keys. We could talk about access control to make sure that only authorized users can access the sensitive data. And then we could talk about data masking, which means we can obfuscate the sensitive data so that way, even if somebody does see it, they don't see the very personal information. For instance, if we had credit card information, we could change the credit card numbers so they're not real credit card numbers. They don't see the actual credit card number of the end user. When we're dealing with integrity, we're wanting to make sure that the data remains accurate, consistent, and unaltered by any unauthorized individual. So how do we do this? Well, we can use hashing, which is a way to make sure that no data has been altered. We can use digital signatures to make sure that all communications are not tampered with and that all senders and receivers can be verified. We can use version control, where we can track the changes and even revert if necessary, or even identify when unauthorized modifications have been done. When we move on to availability, again, availability is making sure that it's accessible by authorized users. We need to make sure that we have proper data backups. If something did happen, do we have proper backups in case we need to bring the data back to provide it to be available to the authorized users? Do we have redundant systems and failover servers in case something crashes? Because you will have hardware and network failures. Building redundancy into these systems helps us keep availability for our users. And then finally, do we have distributed denial of service mitigation strategies to make sure that, hey, even during high traffic attacks, are we still able to provide it available to the authorized users? All right, so let's talk about DLP. So DLP itself is called data loss prevention. And data loss prevention is a set of tools and policies that's designed to prevent authorized access of sharing, transmission of sensitive information. So that sounds kind of like interesting. It's like, okay, what does that really mean? And really, DLP is just to ensure that the data is used and shared securely. We want to make sure that it's in compliance with data protection regulations and that it's available to the authorized users. And if it does get stolen or try to pull from an unauthorized users, do we have a system in place to prevent that from happening? So there's a few different key components to DLP. And the first component will be the data identification and classification. So we need to classify all our data before we can even install a DLP, mainly because, well, how do we know what protections to put against the data? Once we know that, we can then go to monitoring and detection. DLP can then scan documents and emails in anything that we are using for transit for different things like credit card numbers, sensitive information like social security numbers, and even use different things like behavior analysis to help us detect when users are not doing what they're supposed to be doing. We need a system that will enforce this, so it's a policy enforcement and prevention, where it may just be an alert to let administrators know that sensitive data is being accessed and transmission that's violating our policies. It may actively block the user from doing it, and it may even quarantine files to make sure that it can be reviewed by the security team before they're released again. And then finally, DLPs normally have data encryption. They normally enforce our data encryption policies to make sure that if there's data is at rest or even in transit, that they are being encrypted and used properly. If for some reason it detects that it's not, then we come back to policy enforcement and prevention. Okay. We have a few different types of DLPs here. And one of the types is going to be a network DLP. Network DLPs monitor the network for the data that's in transit. They're looking at emails, file transfers, network traffic, anything to help detect and prevent unauthorized sharing or transmission of sensitive data. We have endpoints DLPs, which is normally installed on like user devices like laptops or mobile devices, and it helps us monitor any of the data that's currently in use. If it sees that you're trying to copy, unauthorized copy, printing, or transferring of sensitive information, this is when the DLP steps into action. And then finally, we've got our cloud DLPs, pretty much doing the same thing, but we're focusing on how data is stored and transmitted in cloud services. As organizations are now really moving to the cloud DLPs are starting to grow in popularity. These environments just ensures compliance with regulations. Right. So, as we went through this, we talked a little bit about data sovereignty, we talked about data protection, and I hope this was helpful. Our next section is going to be about cryptography, and we'll talk a bit about how cryptography is used. So we keep using the generic term of encryption throughout all of these videos, and I want you to know that when we're talking about encryption, we're talking about cryptography. So let's talk more about that in the next segment. See you then.